So we're going to read a book today called Uncle Monarch and the Day of the Dead. "They're here," Lupita cried. She ran to the rocking chair where her uncle was dozing and touched his arm. When he opened his eyes, she whispered, "Tio Urbano, they're here." "Are you sure?" he asked. Quickly, quickly, Nina, hand me my cane. It is the best of luck to see them arrive." Tio Urbano struggled to his feet, his knees creaking like the wooden floor under him. He put his hand on Lupita's shoulder. They walked out of the house and watched as the first monarch butterflies fluttered to the safety of the trees. That is right. Lupita put out her hand, and a tired monarch landed on it. It stayed for a moment before flying off to blend with the others. Tio Urbano said, "Pequeña, do you remember what I have told you ever since you were a baby?" Lupita nodded and said, "I must never capture or hurt a monarch, for they are the souls of our dead ones, who have come back to visit us before Dia de Muertos." Tio Urbano put his arm around Lupita. "Never be afraid of the dead," he said, "for those who loved us can never hurt us. We will always miss them." This makes me cry. "We will always miss them, and this is why it is a blessing to receive the butterflies before Dia de Muertos, when we show our dead that they are treasured and not forgotten. Besides, it is a pleasure to see butterflies return every year." Day after day, Lupita and Tio Urbano watched the butterflies fill the trees until there were millions in the woods. On sunny days, they flew about searching for food and water until the forest was a quivering blur of orange and black. On cloudy days, the butterflies didn't take wing. Instead, they clung to the tree trunks and pressed tightly together for warmth. Soon after the arrival of the butterflies, Lupita's family got ready for Dia de Muertos. Papa set up the arch of, I'm going to try, Cempasúchil flowers. He strung rows of colorful papel picado from one end of the living room to the other, which is what is all around here today. Later, he set up the altar and displayed the photographs of family members that had died. Mama gathered the ingredients she would need for preparing the pan de muertos, mole, tamales, tortillas, atole, and rice and beans, and the dead had liked in life and would now enjoy in spirit. Lupita cleared a path that led from the altar to the street. She knew exactly how she would make the trail of petals of Cempasúchil that would guide the spirits home. This year, it would be as wide and as thick as possible so that no one would get lost. Everything was done like last year, except that Tio Urbano couldn't help in any way. He sat wrapped in blankets and dozed most of the day by the fireplace, mumbling in his sleep. When he was awake, and if his bones weren't aching, he watched the butterflies. A few days before Dia de Muertos, Tio Urbano took to his bed. Lupita sat by his side for hours. She stroked his hand and spoke to him about school and her friends, but he never opened his eyes. One morning, Lupita was dreaming of butterflies when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She opened her eyes, and when she saw the tears tracing a path down her father's cheeks, she knew. "Tio Urbano?" she asked in a whisper. Papa nodded. "I know how much you will miss him, Pequeña," he said, "but try to remember the good times you spent with him. He would like that." After that, the days were cold and dark for Lupita. Tio Urbano's photo was added to the ones on the altar, and a plate of his favorite enchiladas was added to the other dishes. Lupita missed seeing him in his old rocking chair. A gray feeling filled her heart, and she felt better only when, on sunny days, the monarchs flew around the meadow. On the first day of November, Dia de Muertos arrived. That night, Lupita's family and neighbors gathered in the cemetery. They lit torches and candles, and each family cleaned their relatives' gravestones. They painted the gravestones in bright colors and covered them with flowers and food. Some prayers were said, and a woman sang a hymn accompanied by a guitar. After a while, an air of festivity spread throughout the cemetery as adults told stories and ate their fill, and children played hide and seek among the gravestones. Lupita looked at the new grave that needed no fresh paint. She stayed close to her mother, and later on wrapped herself in a warm blanket and fell asleep. Early the next morning, Mama woke Lupita and whispered, "Come, Pequeña, it is time to go home." Lupita shook off the blanket, she pulled her jacket closer, and glanced at the cloudy sky. There wasn't a butterfly in sight. While Mama and Papa walked ahead among the graves, Lupita turned for one last look at her uncle's gravestone. On one of the flowers was a lone monarch butterfly, gently moving its wings. Lupita watched as it rose, fluttered above her head, and flew away. She stared until she lost sight of it among the trees. Then she smiled and whispered, "Goodbye. Tio Urbano, my uncle monarch, I'm sure I'll see you next year." Lupita left the cemetery, and as she ran to catch up with her family, felt the gray begin to lift from her heart. The end.
So, interestingly, this passage that we just heard makes this distinction between how this author understands life and death and the way that we tend to understand life and death. We typically, I think of death as one part of a category in a binary pair. There is life and death. They sort of go together. And what we mean when we talk about death is usually biological, life-related, right? Heartbeat, brain waves, breath, and then the absence of those things is death. When we no longer have those, we're dead. And so let's think about that on a horizontal plane, right? Life, death. When you're above the line, you're alive. When you're not, you're dead. Or you can be one or the other. Either you're alive, or when you're not alive, then you're dead. So I could have prepared my remarks for tonight. Instead, I was doodling. I was making these slides. But this letter, interestingly, the authors are trying to articulate what they call, and this keeps coming up, eternal life, which actually isn't about biological life. It's not about time or quantity. It's not about going somewhere else when you die and living there forever. This has been misread throughout the history of the Christian tradition. Not at all what they're talking about. It's not about quantity. It's not about relocating. It's actually about quality in this location. It's about actually being alive while you're in this life. So the fullest life here and now. And so this author is sort of musing, and it seems to orbit this idea, not of life after death, but if we could say the main question is really, is there life before death? And what the author seems to be saying is that the way to life before death is to love. That's how to move in this life. That's how you move from death to life in this life. That's what he says. We know we have moved from death to life when we love. That's how you're really most fully alive in this life. So that makes sense. Seems to think that moving from death to life is actually more of, I've been sort of thinking of it as like a vertical plane. So if love is in front of you, you can move through love and move from death to life. Maybe like that, like death on one side, life on the other. Almost as if we can step through this plane, right, from death to life by loving. That this is something we can do. We can actually choose to move through love from life to death in this life. And as fascinating as this is, and I actually decided this week, this is what I want to talk about on Easter, which is great to know, because that's like 6 months away. But I'll come back to that later. But the more fascinating thing for me tonight, especially as we celebrate the Day of the Dead, Dia De Los Muertos, is that I think the same vertical plane also exists in death. That this same idea exists for our loved ones who have passed away. It's the idea of the Day of the Dead, that when our loved ones who have died, specifically, when we love them by remembering them, that is how we love them. We help them to move from death to life. So in the Day of the Dead legend, and I actually learned this from the brilliant kids film. What's the name of it? Tosh? Book of Life, yeah. So if you don't know about Day of the Dead, watch Book of Life. It's amazing. So in the legend, it's only when the dead are forgotten that they truly die. And then they sort of die the true death, and they sort of live out the rest of their time in the land of the forgotten. But when we love them, when we remember them, we help them to move from death to life. They go on in the land of the remembered. So by loving these people, even in their death, by loving the loved ones that we've lost, even in their death, we move them from the land of the forgotten to the land of the remembered. We move them from death to life. Or in other words, they live on in us, in our memory, as we love them by keeping them with us. They live on in us. George Eliot famously says, "Our dead are never dead to us until we have forgotten them." And so tonight, we're going to remember. Don't do it. All right, so what we've got is an altar of candles. Many of you sent in photos of your loved ones, and so we're going to begin with a few minutes of silence, and we're going to play a slideshow. And I think it's amazing, the way this has accumulated over the years. I think we've got photos of more than like 50 or 60 of our loved ones, the people we love who have passed on. So we're going to sit silently. The slideshow is going to play. If you feel moved, you can come up and grab one of these. That one's on the floor if you want that one. The rest of them are up there. And you can light this up, one of the candles there, and then light one of these candles. And we're just going to sit silently and remember. This is a part of the way we honor our loved ones. Everybody good? All right. Let's remember well together, and in our memory, may our loved ones move again from death to life. But I think it's significant that when Jesus comes to the end of his life, he's aware not just of what it means to live well, but what it means to die well. And so when he's with his friends, he breaks bread and he says, "This is my body, and this is my blood." And I think sometimes we get overly religious, hyper spiritual. We might as easily have said, "This is my pistachio green salad that Kenny's family makes. This is the meatballs of life. This is the chili." These are the significant things by which you remember me. And the invitation is to remember. Interestingly, I think the Eucharist shares so much with the Day of the Dead. This is special food, a special altar, an invitation to remember, and the idea that the dead live on in us, that if they live on at all, they live on in us. And so in the same way that our loved ones go on, in the same way that when we taste that food, we're triggered, we remember they're with us again. In that same way, the life and the love, the justice, the mercy, the kindness, the hospitality that we see and know in the life of Jesus, when we remember, we're inviting this to live again, to live on in us. And so each week we have this sort of mini Day of the Dead celebration where we come together and we set a table and we remind ourselves that this bread and this wine, this table, is set for us, but it is set for us and for all people. And part of what marks the significance of this table is that no one will ever be turned away. So if you feel moved, feel free to come and grab a piece of the bread and dip it in the cup. Feel free to light a candle if you haven't had a chance yet. And we will continue to practice this form of remembrance.